Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is lucid dreaming. With me is Dr. Stephen Labarge, the author of the book Lucid Dreaming and Exploring the World of Lucid Dreams. Dr. Labarge is the founder of the Lucidity Institute in Palo Alto, California. He is also a research associate at the Dream Laboratory at Stanford University. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Let's begin by defining lucid dreaming.
Yes. Well, lucid dreaming just means dreaming while knowing that you're dreaming. So it means being conscious of the fact that you're dreaming while it's happening. Most people will have experienced lucid dreaming at least once, and they usually say in a nightmare, recognize, oh, this is all a dream, and then waking up. But few people have taken it to the possibilities it offers, the kind explored by the Tibetans, for instance, that you could stay in that dream and then use it to explore impossible realities somehow.
Some people think of lucid dreaming as being a distinct, altered state of consciousness.
Well, it is definitely a unique experience in that the ordinary dreams we have every night, first of all, are a world that seems as real as the one we're in right now. Yet it's all clearly in our minds, as we discover when we wake up. Lucid dreaming adds something extraordinary. It adds consciousness, full consciousness that you are dreaming at that moment. So you're sitting here, as we might be, when you suddenly realize that, oh yes, you went to sleep this afternoon and this is an afternoon nap and all of this is going on in your dream, for instance. Everything might seem just as real as it does right now, except for you would know that there wouldn't be any laws of physics or any laws of society that you had to concern yourself with. So it gives you a great deal of freedom at that point. But it would seem as real as this, and it's an extraordinary experience. People find it astonishingly empowering to see that their mind has that capacity.
In other words, you can do anything whatsoever in the lucid dream state and do it consciously.
Yes. Well, anything within the limits of what is imaginable. There are some things that are, say, inconsistent with themselves that couldn't be imaginable, but basically, you're limited not by the usual laws of physics and laws of society and other external constraints on you, as we are limited greatly in waking life, but you're limited only by what the limits of the mind might be, which in practical terms often is your own expectation. So if you think you can't do something in a lucid dream state, you can't do it. And in fact, say if this were a lucid dream right now and I said, well, this chair here is not really solid, it's just a dream, so I should be able to pass my hand through it, but I might not be able to just because of my long-standing experience with chairs that they are solid, and so that unconscious expectation might interfere. Until then I imagine, for instance, let's think of that chair as slightly porous, and then my hand begins to pass through, and then I'm able, by overcoming that expectation, to pass the hand right through. And in general, we find that we're limited by our expectation. If you think that the door is locked, you don't find out that it's not. Right? So it doesn't have to be locked. These mental constraints can be as much a constraint as physical exterior ones.
It would seem then that practicing in the lucid dream state would be practicing the art of imagination.
Yes, yes. It's very true that there is an art of lucid dreaming. It's not something that once you know, oh, this is a dream, then you know how to do everything. There are certain arts you have to develop to find out exactly how you can accomplish tasks, because we have to overcome our very extensive sets of expectations based on our experiences in waking life. Because we have, in perceiving the world around us right now, a major determinant of what we perceive is what we have perceived in the past, what we have seen in the past, what we therefore expect to perceive now. And so one of the things that people, when they're first beginning to learn lucid dreaming, constantly are doing is they're doing things that would make sense if they were awake, but don't make much sense while they're in a lucid dream. So for example, in one case I recall, I was going across the Dream Stanford campus I didn't know it was a dream yet, and I had left my briefcase behind. So I was going back to get that briefcase. And now I realized I was dreaming. I said, oh, this is wonderful. So I started to fly back to where I was going without immediately occurring to me, well, there's no use in getting that briefcase. It's only in a dream. So it doesn't make sense any longer. But we have to overcome those tendencies and to rethink the new world we're in and think, well, what are the rules here? Well, what makes sense for this new kind of life sphere I'm in?
Yeah. So it's one thing to be aware of the fact that you are in a dream, and maybe it's another thing to be aware that you're caught up in various layers of logic that you don't or that you can stay in or not as you choose.
That's right. Well, these are unconscious largely, these expectations about how the world works. And so we don't notice them until in the dream we notice this doesn't make sense in the world I'm in any longer, and then you're able to change them. So there's a learning process that goes on where your thinking gets clearer. You get more precisely adapted to the dream world, because the rules of the dream world and the waking world are very different, and there are certain commonalities, but there's also very important differences, and it's important to know which world you're in order to play the proper game.
Now, up until very recently, the lucid dream, although it's been acknowledged by writers going back to Aristotle, it wasn't really accepted in modern psychology.
Well, yes, that's true. It wasn't, as you say, Aristotle at least wrote about lucid dreaming. He said sometimes it happens that people will recognize while they're in the midst of sleep that what they're seeing is a dream. And there are other instances throughout history where you see someone pointing this out. Someone might use it, for example, as St. Augustine did, as proof for life after death, because you see, just as one can have this full experience of life without a body, namely in the dream as he interpreted it, then the same thing must be the case after death. You see various mentions throughout history up until the 19th century, when a few pioneers in the West at least started to study the topic more extensively. The Marquis David de Saint-Denis wrote a whole book about lucid dreaming and had many thousands of experiences. And
when was this written?
This was in the middle of the last century, and his book was called Dreams and the Means of Guiding Them. And he understood the fact that dreams were built out of expectations in past history and the general model you have of the world. And he had a very modern view of this. But as you mentioned, until very recently, psychologists didn't seem to believe in the existence of lucid dreaming. And this came from a kind of paradox that occurred to them, as they thought, well, to be asleep is to be unconscious, because we say a sleeping person is unconscious of what's going on around him. But that doesn't mean that he's necessarily unconscious of what's going on inside his mind at the point. Right. So they overgeneralized to say to be asleep is to be unconscious. They also had the idea that dreams, lucid or otherwise, are unconscious processes, which isn't really true. They have to be conscious processes or we wouldn't be able to remember them.
Yes.
Now, the fact that we can remember them shows that there's a certain level of consciousness present. What's normally absent from the dream is simply a specific reflective consciousness that what is going on now is all in my mind. That's the difference. It's not that people don't see things that they consciously report. Now, when I first started to do my scientific research on the topic, I had had lucid dreams myself, so I knew they were real. And then I got interested and I started reading what other people and what the scientific experts said about it, and I found, surprisingly, that it couldn't happen.
Some of these same experts were even denying the existence of dreams altogether.
Well, that's true. That's still a more extreme case. That takes a philosopher to do something like that. Philosophers who say, well, people don't actually have these experiences during sleep. All they have is they have stories they wake up and tell. It's a behaviorist philosopher. But I don't think we need to discuss ideas such as that. But it seems reasonable to suppose that if you've got the idea that sleep is a relatively unconscious process, that if people report having the experience of knowing that they're in a dream, that maybe they were partially awake or having some sort of wake-sleep combination state of some kind. Yeah. And so that wasn't a totally unreasonable point of view that lucid dreaming wouldn't be a phenomenon of normal sleep. But it turned out to be exactly something that occurs in normal REM or paradoxical sleep.
paradoxical sleep?
Well, the REM sleep, the state of rapid eye movement sleep, active sleep is also called, was originally called on the continent paradoxical sleep because it exhibited so many unexpected phenomena of such an activated brain that they had to call it paradoxical. The sort of common sense idea of sleep is it's a state of passive inactivity. Nothing much is going on. You're just resting somehow. And that isn't a bad description of one phase of sleep, the delta sleep, the quiet sleep as it's often called these days. But about 90 minutes after you've fallen asleep, if you're watching someone, you find that their brain suddenly turns on as if it's become awake, except for the body is still paralyzed. In fact, it now is actually more paralyzed than it was at any other stage of sleep. There's a specific mechanism that causes complete loss of muscle tone. Then you see all kinds of other events, muscle twitches, you see respiratory irregularities. If you, for example, you watch the family dog or cat, you'll see that they've got two kind of postures. One that's sort of the sphinx posture for the cat, and the other is that flopped posture, which is the REM sleep or the paradoxical sleep. Anyway, people hadn't expected to see such an activated brain in a sleeping body. But nevertheless, as in the 50s when this was first discovered, the association with dreaming was also discovered. And for maybe 20 years, there was a great deal of research done on the physiology, the psychophysiology of dreaming based on studies of REM sleep and the conscious reports that people would make on awakening from these states. Now, as I was saying, I had both had the experience of lucid dreaming, so I knew that it was real and that it was definitely sleep. I knew that because I could be in a lucid dream. Let's say this were the dream right now, and I'd say, well, here I experience this body that I feel in front of me. I know my physical body is asleep in bed with the hands are under the covers. I don't feel any covers. I don't hear the clock ticking next to my bed, so I know this must be asleep. I'm not in sensory contact with the environment. Even when I look for the information, I don't find it there. So I know I'm asleep, and I know I'm vividly in another world. So how could I determine that this is actually happening during sleep? How could I prove that to someone else other than me? Well, I got the idea of how to do that from some of the work that had been done in the 50s and 60s with REM sleep. One study, actually a series of studies, had shown that sometimes there was a very striking relationship between the direction the eyes would move in the dream and the direction the eyes in the sleeping body would move. So for instance, in one case, the subject was awakened after showing a very regular series of left, right eye movements, about 24. And when they asked the subject, what were you just dreaming? He said, I was standing on the side of a ping pong table watching a very long volley. And so it's obvious that you could have a precise relationship between where you looked in the dream and what happens to your physical eyes. That's the one of the few parts of the body that is not paralyzed during REM sleep, so you can volitionally move them. So I thought, well, in the lucid dream, I certainly could look to the left and right and left and right, and that could then be a signal indicating to the laboratory that I knew I was dreaming at that moment. So indeed, we did that and found that when I became lucid in the dream and made that eye movement signal, it occurred during unequivocal REM sleep. And so even, say, 10 or 15 minutes before the end of the REM period. So there was no doubt from that kind of proof that lucid dreaming was a reality of sleep, that it happened during not some almost awake state, but during the paradoxical phase of sleep.
Because all the other physiological measurements showed that you were sleeping.
Exactly, and so you might say that the lucidity, in fact, is the most paradoxical element of the paradoxical sleep.
Well, I want to point out that this seems like a scientific breakthrough, perhaps of enormous significance, that you were able to, from the sleep state, actually transmit a message to people who are in the waking state.
Well, that's what one of our two reviewers, when we made the first paper describing the results, we submitted it to the Science Journal, and one of the two reviewers said exactly what you did. The other one said, well, I don't know exactly what's wrong with this study, but there's obviously something wrong with it because it's impossible. So it was rejected. And in fact, we went through some difficulty in overcoming the bias against the idea of lucid dreaming. I was happy to note, though, after the data had been shown in scientific meetings, the Sleep Research Society and so on, that by and large people changed their minds. Even the ones that had said it was impossible, when they saw the evidence, tended to say, all right, well, what do you know?
Yeah.
There's more strange things happening in the sleeping brain than we had realized.
And now you've been doing research in this area for the last 15 years or more.
Yes. And it has been a bit of a struggle. It's outside the mainstream of supported research. For one thing, you found that I said the dream research went on for about 20 years, a little less than that, because in the 60s and early 70s, governmental support for dream research dried up, and then one was left only with support for sleep disorders medicine. And so that's what happened to people that used to study dreaming, then focused their activities on looking at the what can go wrong with sleep. And what interests me most is what could go right with sleep. How could we make the most use of it? How could we get the most for the time that we have to spend asleep, which seems to be a third of our lives approximately. Why couldn't we make better use of that time? I think there's a great potential in the dream state where we kind of sleep through our dreams, in that we don't recognize that they're virtual reality in which we could do anything at that point. Instead, we act out pretty much melodramas like our waking lives, only our waking lives when things go wrong, because in the dream world, things often go wrong because we believe we're awake and we have difficulties. For instance, a typical dream that I will have from time to time is, let's say after filming this interview, I'm on my way back to Palo Alto, so I'm got in the car and I'm looking for the freeway. And I drive around, and I know there was a freeway exit or an entrance right here. There was, when I got off the freeway, but where is it now? And well, the problem is it's a dream, and so it's not surprising that the dream doesn't exactly represent my map of San Francisco.
In fact, that's almost one of the qualifications to be a dream, is it's going to have these quirky discrepancies.
Yes, well, dreams are constructed out of what's already in our minds. There's no external stabilizer for them. There's no structure of the physical world that keeps them constant, and that is one reason for the great differences between the ordinary experience in the dream and in the waking state. I said earlier that in the dream state it can be just as vivid and real appearing as waking perception, but it's not as stable. It doesn't, because there's not something outside us to maintain that stabilization.
So you began developing ways for people to use the dream, not just sort of be the passive recipient of the dream, or at most you could share the dream with your analyst later on in the week and try and interpret dreams, but actually working with the dreams. It sounds like a revolutionary idea. I think it's been hard to accept in academic psychology, at least, although there's, I'm sure, a large popular following. But you've also pointed out that this idea goes back at least as far as the ancient Tibetans, if not even to St. Augustine.
Yes. Well, the Tibetans have certainly been using lucid dreaming as a practical application in their culture since perhaps 1,000 years ago. And their use of lucid dreaming is as an advanced yogic practice. They only do it after they've already become experts in visualizations, for example, and have practiced meditation for many years. And so as one of their more advanced practices, they then attempt to recognize that they're dreaming. And they use that as a means of experimenting with their perception of reality and generalizing from, I see everything in the dream around me and I can change it. I can change your height, I can change your sex, I could change you into a plant, for example, and all of these things, because it's only an image. And I then recognize from that, I can then generalize and say, while I'm awake, when I see you, I see an image. Now there may be actually someone there in the physical world, it is true, but what I see is in my mind. And so they then understand that everything they see must be in their minds. And that then gives them a new view of the difference between an appearance and a possible reality beyond it. And so they use it as a kind of means of transcending the ordinary notions of what reality is. And so they developed various techniques that they have been using over the ages, some of which we have adapted in some ways to Western practice, given that, as I said, it's an advanced practice in the Tibetan tradition. The techniques for inducing lucid dreams among the Tibetan yogis are actually quite complex. They imagine a 1,000-petaled lotus with various symbols inside of it vividly. And well, that's already something that might be difficult for people to do. Yet, if you've spent 10 years doing that sort of meditation, of course, that's no
Comes
problem.
naturally.
That's right. So one of the things we had to do is understand what were the essence of these techniques and take it out of the Tibetan cultural context and put it into the Western one, which is simplified is what it really is done, yet we've still developed techniques that have been quite effective.
And I suppose in passing it's probably useful to mention that there are other cultural sources for working with dreams besides the Tibetans.
Yes. Well, most other cultures in the world take dreams more seriously than our Western culture does. And I think that some of the work with lucid dreaming ought to change some of these ideas that in the West we think of dreams as airy nothings by and large, that these are things that are just in the mind, that have no real impact.
In fact, one of the major current theories equates dreams to being like excretion, just sort of the residue, with the waste of the brain.
Right. Or even what you're trying to forget or what you're trying to get rid of somehow. And I don't give much credence to those theories. I don't think they make sense in terms of understanding why would such a device evolve. I think it's much easier to understand by saying, well, when we dream, we use exactly the same mental machinery as we use while we're perceiving the world while awake. It's the same mechanism, but under the special conditions of sleep. So when sensory input is cut off, so there's very little sensory input, then what we're left with is what's within our own minds. Our past experience, our motivations, our expectations, and all the rest of that then build a dream world that tells us about what's inside of ourselves. But it's not doing it to send messages or to tell us something. It's doing it because the mind, the brain is designed by evolution to tell us what's going on in the world around us and what to do about it, how to get what we want and avoid what we don't want. And it does it anytime it's working well enough, which happens during REM sleep when the brain gets turned on and active enough.
So you began devising methods for enabling people to enter into the lucid dreaming state almost at will.
Well, when I was first studying this as a PhD student at Stanford back in the late 70s, I had the main challenge of being able to have lucid dreams myself in the laboratory because I was having lucid dreams more frequently as I was trying to develop the skill. But if I would be in the laboratory on one night out of the 7 of the week and I didn't have a lucid dream there, it was useless. So I had to develop a technique that I could use on the night I was in the laboratory. And I was able to develop a technique based on prospective memory or memory for future intentions. We have sort of the rudimentary capacity to remember what we want to do tomorrow, for example. Well, we can apply that capacity to what we want to do later tonight when I'm dreaming. So I developed a technique based on mnemonics, seeing a visualization of myself in the dream that I just woke up from and saying, the next time I'm dreaming, I want to remember to recognize that it's a dream. And that led with some practice to the ability to have lucid dreams whenever I wanted to. And then, which was very useful for laboratory studies, but
you also developed a device to help awaken people, or am I getting ahead of the story?
Well, we actually started working on external stimuli as a means of helping people have lucid dreams back in the late 70s. The idea was, well, if we're trying to remember to do something when we're in the dream state, then we want to best give ourselves reminders. Just as right now, you want to remember to do something tomorrow, you write a note. But it's hard to write a note that you'll see in the dream world. So we use the fact that external stimuli, what's going on in the world around you as you're sleeping, sometimes appear in your dreams. The alarm clock goes off, but you don't wake up. Instead, you dream about the alarm clock and maybe change it into a siren or something. So we used that fact. First of all, we used the technique of having tape recordings being played during REM sleep. That would say, "This is a dream." And that would appear in your dream. You say, "This is a dream." Oh, yes, so it is. But it also tended to wake people up frequently because we use our auditory sense, our ears, to monitor the environment for danger as we sleep. So we had the idea of trying other sensory modalities that might not be so subject to awakenings. And the one that was most successful was light. So we first started out with goggles, that, welder's goggles, and then sleep goggles that had lights in them that would then flash during REM sleep. We had to,
the instrument would detect that you're in the sleep state, that there's REM movements, rapid eye movements.
Well, at first the instrument was the sleep technician watching a polygraph while the person was asleep.
Pressing a button.
That's right, exactly. And we had success with that particular method, and we started then building devices to say, well, maybe it takes a lot of work for somebody watching the record all night and causing the stimulus to occur just when the person is in REM sleep. So,
well, we're running out of time, Tom. I suppose the point is that you've been successful in developing these devices and in using them in the laboratory.
That's right. Well, and not just in the laboratory, but we developed devices that do have sensors built into the mask that could be used at home. So that, of course, was one of our major goals, which is to make lucid dreaming available in general to people so that they could make better use of it.
And now through your Lucidity Institute in Palo Alto, you have a team of, I think, hundreds now of people. You call them onironauts, who are the explorers of the dream world, who report these experiences to you.
Yes.
Stephen, we're out of time now, but it's been a pleasure being with you for part one, and I hope those who are viewing and watching will check their guides for part two of our series on lucid dreaming. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.